Second, the decisions made in the next decade will determine whether the Arctic becomes a zone of cooperation or conflict. And right now, it's trending toward conflict. Third, the people of Greenland deserve agency in their own future. This isn't just about superpowers. It's about 56,000 people whose home is being fought over like a prize. Fourth, climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It's reshaping global power dynamics in real time. And finally, the frozen island isn't frozen anymore. And that changes everything. So the next time you see a headline about Greenland, don't scroll past. Pay attention. Because this frozen battlefield might just determine who dominates the 21st century. Now I want to hear from you. In the comments, tell me, do you think Greenland should declare independence? Should they align with the West, China, or stay neutral? And do you think this could actually lead to military conflict? If this video opened your eyes to something you didn't know about, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the geopolitical stories the mainstream media glosses over. Because this is just the beginning. The Arctic is waking up, and the world is about to get a lot more complicated. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Picture this. You're standing on a sheet of ice so thick it's been frozen for 110,000 years. The temperature is minus 40 degrees. Your breath crystallizes instantly. The wind cuts through your parka like a knife. Beneath your feet, 2 miles of solid ice. Around you, absolute silence. This is Greenland, population 56,000. Polar bears, more than you'd like to count. Strategic value, infinite. Because right now, while you're watching this video, 2 superpowers are quietly positioning themselves for control of this frozen wasteland. China is investing billions. The United States just offered to buy it for the second time in history. Russia is circling like a shark. And Denmark, the country that technically owns it, is watching nervously from across the Atlantic. But here's what they're not telling you on the news. This isn't about ice. It's not about polar bears or Inuit culture or climate research stations. It's about rare earth minerals worth 1.5 trillion. It's about military dominance in the Arctic. It's about shipping routes that could cut global trade time by 40%. It's about who controls the 21st century. And Greenland, this frozen island that most people couldn't find on a map 6 months ago, has suddenly become the most important piece of real estate on planet Earth. Today, we're going deep. We're going to dissect exactly why the world's superpowers are circling Greenland like vultures. We'll expose the minerals buried beneath the ice. We'll reveal the military strategies being drawn up in Beijing, Washington, and Moscow. And by the end, you'll understand why this frozen island might just trigger the next global crisis. Let's begin. Before we talk about politics, we need to understand why Greenland is geographically priceless. Pull up a standard world map, the Mercator projection you saw in school. Greenland looks massive, almost as big as Africa. That's distorted. In reality, Greenland is 836,000 square miles, about 1/3 the size of the continental United States. Still enormous, but here's what matters. Location, location, location. Greenland sits directly between North America and Europe. It's only 1,500 miles from Washington, D.C. It's 1,200 miles from London. And here's the kicker. It's positioned right along the shortest flight path between the U.S. and Russia. During the Cold War, this made Greenland the ultimate early warning system. The U.S. built Thule Air Base in 1951, the northernmost American military installation on Earth. From Thule, radar systems could detect Soviet missiles the moment they launched. Even today, Thule houses critical components of the U.S. ballistic missile defense system. But the geography gets more interesting. The Arctic is melting. And I know climate change is a whole separate conversation, but here's the brutal geopolitical reality. As the ice melts, new shipping routes are opening. The Northwest Passage, a route through the Arctic that connects the Atlantic and Pacific, has been frozen and impassable for most of human history. Not anymore. In 2019, 160 ships made the journey through Arctic waters. By 2030, that number is projected to hit 500. By 2040, the Arctic could be ice-free in summer months. Why does this matter? Right now, if you want to ship goods from Shanghai to Rotterdam, you sail 12,000 nautical miles through the Suez Canal. That takes 48 days. The Arctic route, 7,200 nautical miles, 24 days. You've just cut global shipping time and cost by half. And Greenland sits right in the middle of this new trade highway. But wait, there's more. And this is where it gets scary. Beneath Greenland's ice sheet lies an estimated $1.5 trillion worth of rare earth minerals. We're talking about neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, elements you've never heard of but are critical for everything from smartphones to electric vehicle batteries to missile guidance systems. Right now, China controls 80% of global rare earth production. They have a stranglehold on the minerals that power modern technology. If Greenland's deposits become accessible, and they will as the ice melts, whoever controls Greenland controls the future of tech manufacturing. So let's recap what we have. A strategic military position between superpowers. The future of global shipping routes, 1.5 trillion in critical minerals. And a population of just 56,000 people with limited capacity to defend it. Now do you see why everyone's suddenly interested in this frozen rock? But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because Greenland isn't just a prize. It's becoming a battleground. And the players in this game are making moves right now. Let me show you what's happening behind the scenes. August 2019. President Trump floats the idea of buying Greenland from Denmark. The media laughs. Late-night comedians have a field day. Denmark's prime minister calls the idea absurd. But here's what the media missed. Trump wasn't joking, and he wasn't the first American president to try. In 1946, President Harry Truman offered Denmark $100 million for Greenland. Denmark refused. The U.S. didn't give up. They negotiated a defense agreement instead, securing the right to maintain military bases on the island. Fast forward to today. The U.S. military presence in Greenland is more critical than ever. Thule Air Base is home to the 12th Space Warning Squadron, operating a missile warning system that provides 24/7 surveillance of missile launches and space activities. This isn't optional. This is existential. Without Thule, the U.S. loses critical early warning capability against Russian and Chinese hypersonic missiles. But it's not just about defense. The U.S. State Department reopened a consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, in 2020. It had been closed since 1953. Why reopen now? Because the U.S. is terrified of Chinese influence, and they should be. Between 2012 and 2021, Chinese state-owned mining companies invested over $750 million in Greenland mining projects. China's state-owned enterprises have bid on airport construction projects. Chinese researchers have established a research station near Greenland's ice core drilling sites, ostensibly for climate research, but intelligence analysts know better. Here's the playbook. China sends researchers. They map mineral deposits. They build infrastructure. They offer loans Greenland can't refuse. Before you know it, China has leverage. The U.S. strategy is different but equally aggressive. In 2020, the U.S. provided $12.1 million in economic aid to Greenland, the first direct American aid package to the island. That same year, the U.S. Export-Import Bank agreed to finance mining and infrastructure projects in Greenland, directly competing with Chinese investment. The Pentagon is also quietly upgrading facilities at Thule. In 2021, Congress approved $300 million for Arctic infrastructure improvements, much of it directed at Greenland. But here's the problem. Denmark still technically owns Greenland, even though Greenland has home rule and controls most of its internal affairs. And Denmark is part of NATO. That means any Chinese military presence in Greenland would be a NATO Article 5 nightmare. So the US is playing a delicate game. Support Greenland's economic development to keep China out, maintain military dominance through Thule, and ensure Denmark does not lose control to a Greenlandic independence movement that might be more friendly to China. Because that's the real fear. Greenland independence. Greenland's economy is heavily subsidized by Denmark, about $600 million per year, roughly 20% of Greenland's GDP. If Greenland declares independence, who's going to fill that funding gap? China would happily write that check. And that's why the US is so nervous. Because if Greenland gains full independence and accepts Chinese investment to sustain its economy, the US loses its Arctic foothold. Thule Air Base becomes politically vulnerable. And America's northern flank, the most defensible border in US history, suddenly becomes a liability. So when Trump said he wanted to buy Greenland, he wasn't crazy. He was desperate. And here's the thing. Biden's team wants the same thing. They're just quieter about it. But while America scrambles to maintain influence, China is playing an entirely different game. A longer game, a smarter game. Let me show you how. China doesn't need to buy Greenland. They're doing something far more effective. They're making Greenland dependent on them. In 2018, a Chinese state-owned construction company bid to build 3 airports in Greenland, in Nuuk, Ilulissat, and Qaqortoq. These aren't small projects. We're talking about $555 million in infrastructure investment for a country with a GDP of only $3 billion. Denmark and the US went into panic mode. Why? Because airports aren't just airports. They're dual-use infrastructure. An airport that can land commercial planes can also land military transport aircraft. And Chinese state-owned companies answer to Beijing, not market forces. After intense diplomatic pressure, Greenland rejected the Chinese bid. Denmark stepped in and co-financed the airport projects instead. Crisis averted, right? Not quite. Because while the West was focused on airports, China was making moves elsewhere. Mining contracts. Chinese companies control stakes in several Greenlandic mining exploration projects. Shenghe Resources, a Chinese rare earth giant, holds rights to the Kvanefjeld mine, one of the largest deposits of rare earth minerals outside China. If Kvanefjeld goes into production, it could supply 25% of global rare earth demand. Think about that. China already controls 80% of rare earth production. If they control Kvanefjeld too, they have near total monopoly power over the minerals that run the modern world. Research stations. China operates a satellite ground station in Kiruna, Sweden, just 800 miles from Greenland. Chinese researchers have participated in Arctic scientific expeditions and data collection programs in Greenland. Ostensibly, this is for climate research, but data is power. Geological surveys that map ice melt patterns also map where mineral deposits will become accessible first. Diplomatic soft power. China has been courting Greenlandic political leaders for years. In 2017, Greenland's former premier visited China and returned praising the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese state media regularly publishes articles about Greenland needs its right to self-determination, a not-so-subtle jab at Danish colonialism, and a signal that China would support Greenlandic independence. Here's the strategy, and it's brilliant. China doesn't need military bases. They don't need to plant a flag. They just need economic dependence. If Chinese companies control critical mining operations, Greenland needs Chinese investment to sustain its economy. If Greenland needs Chinese investment, it grants more access. More access means more leverage. More leverage means political influence. Political influence means veto power over Western military operations. And suddenly, the US can't count on Thule Air Base being politically stable. But there's another layer to this. China isn't just thinking about Greenland in isolation. They're thinking about the Polar Silk Road, an Arctic shipping route that would connect Asia to Europe through the Arctic Ocean. In 2018, China released an Arctic policy white paper declaring itself a near-Arctic state, with legitimate interests in the region. That's a bold claim for a country whose northernmost point is still 900 miles from the Arctic Circle. But China is deadly serious. They've built the world's largest icebreaker fleet, 35 vessels and counting. Russia has 46, the US, 2. And one of them is 45 years old and barely functional. China is preparing for a future where Arctic shipping routes are the norm, and Greenland sits right in the middle. Here's the nightmare scenario for Washington. By 2040, the Arctic is largely ice-free in summer. Chinese cargo ships and naval vessels routinely traverse the northern sea route. Greenland, now independent, has accepted massive Chinese infrastructure loans. Chinese mining companies control rare earth production on the island. And Greenland, economically beholden to Beijing, asks the US to close Thule Air Base because it's incompatible with Greenland's neutrality. The US loses its Arctic foothold. China gains dominance over a strategic choke point, and the balance of power in the Arctic and potentially the world shifts. Is this paranoid? Maybe. But geopolitical strategy isn't about what's likely. It's about what's possible. And this is very, very possible. But there's a third player in this game. A player who's been operating in the Arctic longer than anyone. A player who's more aggressive, more desperate, and more unpredictable than either the US or China, Russia. While China plans and America reacts, Russia is doing something far more direct. They're militarizing the Arctic at a pace not seen since the Cold War. Let me give you some numbers that should terrify you. Russia operates 50 icebreakers, more than the rest of the world combined. They're building 13 more. These aren't research vessels. Many are nuclear-powered and can smash through ice 10 feet thick. Russia has reopened 6 Soviet-era military bases above the Arctic Circle. These aren't token outposts. We're talking about full-scale installations with runways, barracks, and missile defense systems. In 2020, Russia deployed S-400 air defense systems in the Arctic, capable of shooting down aircraft and missiles within a 250-mile radius. They have tested hypersonic Zircon missiles in Arctic waters, missiles that travel at Mach 9 and are nearly impossible to intercept. And here's the most aggressive move. Russia claims a massive section of the Arctic continental shelf as its sovereign territory under international law. We're talking about 463,000 square miles of seabed, an area larger than California and Texas combined. Why? Because under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, countries can claim exclusive economic rights to the continental shelf extending from their coastline. Russia argues that the Lomonosov Ridge, an underwater mountain range, is an extension of Russian territory. If accepted, this claim would give Russia control over vast underwater mineral deposits and strategic positioning that extends almost to Greenland. But here's where Greenland fits into Russia's calculus. Russia knows they can't compete with Chinese economic power. They can't outspend the United States militarily in the long term. But what Russia can do is create chaos. If the US is distracted fighting over Greenland with China, they're not focused on Eastern Europe. If NATO resources are stretched thin across the Arctic, Russia has more freedom to operate in the Baltic and Black Sea regions. Greenland, for Russia, is a distraction mechanism. By aggressively militarizing the Arctic and staking territorial claims, Russia forces the US to spread its forces thinner. Every dollar spent on Arctic defense is a dollar not spent in the Pacific or Europe. And there's a more sinister possibility. Russia could offer support to Greenlandic independence movements, not because they care about self-determination, but because an independent Greenland creates a power vacuum that complicates NATO operations. Imagine this scenario. Greenland declares independence. Suddenly, the Arctic isn't just contested, it's a full-blown crisis zone with 3 nuclear powers jockeying for position. And the people of Greenland? But here's what's really wild. Russia, China, and the US aren't the only players with Arctic ambitions. Canada, Norway, and Denmark all have claims and interests in the region. But the big 3 are playing at a level of intensity that dwarfs everyone else. So we have America desperately trying to maintain its historical foothold. China slowly buying influence and planning for the long game. And Russia militarizing and destabilizing to keep everyone off balance. 3 superpowers, and 1 frozen island. But here's what nobody's talking about. What do the people of Greenland actually want? Because at the end of the day, Greenland isn't just a chess piece. It's home to 56,000 people who are about to make a decision that could reshape global power dynamics. Let's talk about that. Here's a fact that gets buried in all the geopolitical analysis. Greenlanders don't want to be pawns. They want independence. Polling data from 2023 shows that 68% of Greenlanders support full independence from Denmark. That's not a fringe movement. That's a democratic majority. And honestly, who can blame them? Greenland was colonized by Denmark in the 18th century. For decades, Greenlandic children were forced to speak Danish in schools. Inuit culture was suppressed. It wasn't until 1979 that Greenland gained home rule, and even now, Denmark controls foreign policy, defense, and currency. Greenland's premier, Mute Burup Egede, has been explicit. Greenland's future is in Greenland's hands, not Washington's, not Beijing's, and not Copenhagen's. But here's the brutal economic reality. Independence isn't financially viable. Yet. Greenland's GDP is $3 billion. Denmark provides $600 million annually in subsidies, 20% of the economy. Without that subsidy, Greenland faces a massive budget shortfall. So how does an independent Greenland survive? Option 1, mining. Years of investment before a single dollar of profit. Option 2, accept foreign investment. This is where it gets messy. If Greenland takes Chinese money, the US will view them as hostile. If they take American money, they're just swapping Danish dependence for American dependence. If they try to balance both, they risk getting crushed in the middle. Option 3, massive tourism. And climate-conscious travelers are increasingly aware of the carbon footprint of Arctic tourism. Option 4, a Nordic economic union. Stay loosely affiliated with Denmark and other Nordic countries for economic support while gaining political autonomy. This is probably the most realistic path, but it's also the least sexy from a nationalist perspective. Greenlanders are proud people, and now they're being told their future depends on which superpower they align with. But here's the thing that should worry everyone. Young Greenlanders are increasingly radicalized. Not in a violent sense, but in an anti-Western sense. They see Denmark as a colonizer, and they see China as the only country offering investment without the colonial baggage. If a new generation of Greenlandic politicians comes to power on a platform of Denmark out, America out, sovereignty now, and they accept Chinese infrastructure loans to make independence economically viable, the West loses Greenland. And the scary part? That's not a hypothetical. That's a very real political trajectory already in motion. The 2021 Greenlandic election was dominated by debates over the Kvanefjeld rare earth mine. The winning coalition opposed the mine due to environmental concerns about uranium byproducts. But here's what's interesting. The opposition to that specific mine does not mean opposition to mining generally. It means Greenlanders want control over which projects move forward. And if Western companies demand environmental standards that make projects unprofitable, while Chinese companies offer looser regulations and faster timelines, guess who Greenland will partner with? So here's the impossible choice facing Greenland. Align with the West, maintain democratic values, environmental protections, and ties to NATO, but remain economically dependent and politically constrained. Align with China, gain economic independence through mining revenue and infrastructure investment, but risk becoming a debt colony of Beijing. Thread the needle, try to play all sides, maintain neutrality, and hope the superpowers don't force them to choose. The third option is what Greenland wants, but history suggests it's not what they'll get, because superpowers don't do neutral, especially not in strategic territories worth trillions of dollars. So what happens next? Let's talk about the endgame scenarios. And trust me, some of them are deeply unsettling. Let's game this out. Based on current trajectories, here are the most likely scenarios for Greenland's future. Scenario 1, status quo, plus probability 35%. Greenland remains part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but with expanded autonomy. Denmark increases subsidies, The US negotiates a new defense agreement ensuring Thule remains operational. Western companies develop rare earth mines under strict environmental oversight. China is kept at arm's length through diplomatic pressure and economic counteroffers. This is the best case scenario. It's stable, it's boring, and honestly, it's probably too optimistic. Scenario 2, independence with Western support, probability 25%. Greenland declares full independence by 2035. The US and EU form an economic partnership to replace Danish subsidies. Greenland joins NATO as an independent member state, or under a special defense arrangement. Rare earth mining generates enough revenue to sustain independence within 10-15 years. This scenario requires flawless execution, massive Western investment, and Greenlandic political unity. Possible, but fragile. Scenario 3. Independence with Chinese influence. Probability 30%. Greenland declares independence. Western countries hesitate on the subsidy replacement. China steps in with a $5 billion infrastructure and development package. Chinese companies control rare earth mining. Within a decade, Greenland is economically dependent on Beijing. The US loses Thule, either through forced closure or by choosing to withdraw rather than operate in a Chinese-influenced territory. This is the nightmare scenario for Washington, and it's disturbingly plausible. Scenario 4. Arctic Cold War. Probability 10%. Tensions escalate. Russia makes aggressive territorial claims that overlap with Greenlandic waters. China and the US engage in economic warfare over mining rights. Military incidents occur, maybe a confrontation between naval vessels in disputed waters, or cyber attacks on infrastructure. Greenland becomes a militarized zone. Think of it as the Cuban Missile Crisis, but frozen and in slow motion. Low probability, but catastrophic if it happens. Here's why these scenarios matter. If Scenario 3 happens, Greenland under Chinese economic influence, the entire balance of power in the Arctic shifts. The US loses its northern early warning capability. NATO's northern flank becomes vulnerable. And China achieves something remarkable: strategic presence in the Western Hemisphere without firing a shot. Russia would see this as an opportunity to press their own Arctic claims more aggressively, knowing the US is distracted and divided. Europe would panic because an independent Greenland aligned with China means Arctic shipping routes could be subject to Chinese leverage. Imagine trade routes that bypass the Suez Canal but require good relations with Beijing to access safely. And here's the kicker. All of this could happen within the next 10-15 years. This isn't some distant future problem. Kids graduating high school today will be in their late 20s when Greenland's political status is fundamentally resolved. The decisions being made right now in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, Copenhagen, and Nuuk will shape the 21st century Arctic. And most people have no idea this is even happening. But there's one more factor we haven't discussed yet, the factor that's driving all of this, the melting clock. Here's the darkest irony of this entire situation. Climate change is the reason Greenland matters now. For thousands of years, Greenland was strategically interesting but practically useless. Too frozen. Not anymore. The Greenland ice sheet is melting at a rate of 280 billion tons per year. That's accelerating. But here's what matters for geopolitics. As the ice melts, resources become accessible. Mining operations that were impossible 20 years ago are now economically viable. Rare earth deposits that were buried under miles of ice are now within reach. As the ice melts, shipping routes open. The Northwest Passage, frozen for centuries, is now navigable for several months per year. By 2050, it could be ice-free year-round. As the ice melts, military positioning changes. Naval vessels can operate in waters that were previously ice-locked. Submarines can patrol new routes. Strategic positioning that was irrelevant becomes critical. Climate change isn't just an environmental crisis. It's a geopolitical accelerant. And here's the twisted logic at play. The countries fighting over Greenland are the same countries whose China is the world's largest CO2 emitter. The US is second, Russia is fourth. Together, these three countries account for nearly 50% of global emissions. They're melting the ice that makes Greenland valuable, then fighting over the resources the melting ice reveals. It's colonialism driven by climate change. And the people of Greenland, who contribute almost nothing to global emissions, are the ones who will pay the price. Because as Greenland's ice melts, the island doesn't become a paradise. It becomes a chaotic frontier. And into that instability walk superpowers with checkbooks and warships. The Greenlandic government knows this. Premier Buildup has said, "We didn't cause climate change, but we're living with the consequences. And now the world wants to profit from our melting ice." That's not just rhetoric. That's a statement of historical fact. For decades, Greenland was ignored. Now, suddenly everyone cares, not because they care about Greenlanders, but because Greenland is profitable. And this is the pattern we've seen throughout history. Indigenous peoples sitting on valuable resources become targets of external powers, whether it's gold in the Americas, oil in the Middle East, or rare earth minerals in the Arctic. The names change, the tactics evolve, but the story remains the same. So when you hear about the US wanting to buy Greenland, or China investing in mining, or Russia militarizing the Arctic, remember this: they're not there for the ice. They're there for what's under it. And they're racing the melting clock. But here's the question nobody's asking. What happens when the clock runs out? Let me bring this home. You might be thinking, okay, interesting geopolitical drama, but how does this affect me? Fair question. Here's how. Your smartphone contains rare earth minerals. That means they can restrict exports, spike prices, or use access as political leverage. Your next phone could cost 30% more because of a diplomatic spat over Greenland. Global trade routes are shifting. Prices on everything from electronics to clothing could be affected by who has leverage over Arctic passages. Military stability in the West depends on early warning systems. If the US loses Thule Air Base, missile defense becomes compromised. That might sound abstract, but nuclear deterrence is the foundation of global security architecture. Weaken it, and regional conflicts become more likely. Climate policy is being hijacked. The same countries fighting over Arctic resources are the ones who need to lead on emissions reductions. But if there's profit in the melting ice, where's the incentive to stop the melting? So yes, Greenland matters. It matters a lot. Here's what I want you to remember from this video. First, Greenland is ground zero for 21st century great power competition. It's not hyperbole, it's not exaggeration, it's happening right now,